All right. Proverbs 20, verses 1 through 10. Can somebody read those?
Wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is a plot. The wrath of the king is like the roaring of a lion. Whoever provokes him to anger sins against his own life. It is honorable for a man to stop striving, since any fool can start a quarrel. The lazy man will not plow because of winter. He will beg during harvest and have not. Counsel in the heart of the man, counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man's understanding will draw it out. Most men will proclaim to each his own goodness, but who can find a faithful man? The righteous man walks in his integrity. His children are blessed after him. The king who sits on the throne of judgment scatters all evil with his eyes. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin? Diverse weights and diverse measures, they are both alike, an abomination to the Lord.
Okay. So, let's go to that first verse. Wine's a mocker, strong drink is raging. Whoever's deceived is not wise. Chronologically speaking, Proverbs is really the first book of the Bible to warn against drunkenness. That's interesting. So you think about the timeline of redemptive history, the books of the Bible. Proverbs is where this starts showing up as a major problem. You see in Genesis a few instances of wine being used as an instance for taking advantage of someone, but usually the shame and most of the people that get in trouble aren't the ones that are under wine's influence. Noah was enjoying rest, and it's Ham that gets in trouble. Right? People will quote that story and talk about Noah asleep in his tent and get mad at Noah, and obviously the text slants towards Ham being the one who's doing what's evil. Similarly, Lot, for whatever, with his daughters. That's the other instance I'm thinking of. The daughters use it against him. He shouldn't have, but on the other hand, it's used to deceive. And that's what's interesting, right? That's the closest hint I see to this proverb of it can deceive you, it can fool you, it can pull one over on you. Watch out. And what's interesting is Israel at this time is enjoying a time of stability and prosperity. And there are vices that arise in times of plenty and ease. And this is one of them. Kind of a hedonistic lifestyle. I mean, people are making wine since there's grape juice. I mean, it naturally goes that way. But in terms of having enough of it to have a hedonistic lifestyle, that takes some stability, some resources, a certain cultural condition. Can I put it that way? And so what we have is a warning against overindulging alcohol, but I think we can see that it applies to anything that can impair the mind. Anything that makes people vulnerable to outbursts of what? Brawling, violence, and mockery. Running your mouth. And, can unleash things or set things loose that should not be. And so you need to take care. You'll run into arguments in the 1800s in the American church that say this forbids alcohol altogether. You just can't get that from this text. You get a warning about how alcohol can be dangerous and deceptive. You cannot be deceived by it unless you want to be foolish. And again, what often is the case, young foolish people with alcohol. There can be old foolish people with alcohol too. But the dynamic we find, in terms of young folly, often is accompanied by this, isn't it? Any questions or thoughts before we move on? Yes. All right. Verse 2, the fierce king is as the roaring lion, whoso provokes him to anger sins against his own soul. Don't make the king angry. You're getting yourself into trouble, right? You're visiting evil upon yourself by angering the king. Who needs to know this? His subjects, and then Dr. Newell said the king. Both. Good. I'm glad. It's both. Because the king needs to know he can ruin somebody's day. It's one of those things where, as I become, now I'm no longer just a son, I'm a father. I find out how I can ruin I have the ability to ruin my child's day. I don't want to. Right? You don't want to. And you need to bear your authority with that sort of thing in mind, that it does have an influence on other people. So the king needs to know that he can ruin somebody's day. But also, young people in particular can forget how important authority is and respecting authority is, and boy, will it land you in hot water real quick. And so it's best to know not to tread, in dangerous places with insubordination, right? It's best to know, instead of finding out by experience, right? You can find out by experience how bad the king's wrath can be and how miserable you can make your own life. It's best just to take Solomon's word for it, and that'll be good for you. Why is there a tendency to not take authority seriously, like until it's too late? Yeah, what are the roots of that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what she said.
What are the roots of not respecting leadership?
Poor leadership.
Poor leadership's a fast one, and Solomon was pretty clear about that, right? If you reward evil and punish good, nobody's going to follow you. The other thought, in terms of the foolishness of a person and why they need to be reminded to watch out.
Everyone wants to be in control of their own life and not
Yes.
the authority.
Right. And I think, again and again, I keep running into Solomon this awareness that young people in particular get caught up in their own world, and there's not really anybody outside. Am I correct in thinking that? I mean, that's often how I thought of it as a teenager. It's me and my little thing and my little story. And brother, you're gonna find out some hard lessons if that's how you navigate the world. And that's why you feel like you can be such a smart aleck.
They like to test the bounds of authority.
We want to test the bounds. And it's one thing to test the bounds within lesser authorities. When you start testing the bounds with the big kahuna, whoever that big kahuna is, you're just don't do it then. Now's not the time. Now's the time for yes, sir. No, sir. Marlene.
Well, it's just, it seems like the whole thing is individualism.
Yes.
We try and push that kids be their own person.
But, so, what I'll say about that is the kids trying to be their own person is, the impetus to think that way is very human. They've always been doing that, right? There's always been kinds of stupid shenanigans. What's different is the ideology in our culture that does not push back against that foolishness. To Marlene's point. That's why there's such a foolish culture, right? I keep reiterating, Proverbs shows how our culture, as kind of like if it was soil for a root, it's bad soil for the root of wisdom to grow in. It does not reward wisdom. It does not seem to celebrate it. It seems to value and celebrate those things that are against wisdom, including individualism, including I'm my own person. It's just me, myself, and I. And it's not fertile soil for wisdom. Lori.
And a lot of kids are taught this. I had a dance student who attended Tandem Friends School in Charlottesville, and I appreciate me speaking to them in the way that I had. I had to very quickly let her know that she was not and never could be my peer.
Right.
You know,
And this
I had
should
about
be
40 years on it.
right. And this should be something, this is a role that parenting, it's one of the responsibilities of parents is that you need to teach your kids this, because apparently no one else will in this culture until it's too late. It's going to be too late. Or everybody's going to go into the chaos and the anarchy and all of society will collapse, which also might happen. Either way, the old virtues will come roaring back. That's what I keep saying. I have a very strong confidence. The old ways are going to come back real hard. It just depends on how much pain we have to endure to get to it, and if we'll repent before. Now, that is that role, right? From the subject and from the king, know that you can ruin somebody's day. Verse 3, be the one to give up having the last word or the last punch. Bringing conflict to an end is harder than starting conflict. It's an easy thing to start a conflict. Much harder to bring a conflict to an end. And that is the work of kings, to bring conflicts to an end, to bring peace and order. That's the gold standard you should be looking for. The guy who just picks fights all the time, if he's is that way all the time, he can't seem to create any sort of unity around him or behind him. He's never going to go anywhere. He's just going to be a social outcast. You need to have a fighting spirit to fight for what's right, but if you're just fractious all the time, and you always have to have the last word, then the cycle's never going to stop. Because then the other person wants to get the last word. And then you have to have the last word. And then they have to have the last word. And it goes around and around and around and around until everybody's blind, right? Everybody keeps taking eyes until they're blind. And they're always usually what happens in those cycles is somebody goes a little bit more. And then the other person goes even a little bit more. And it keeps escalating. And who here likes to read Shakespeare or watch Shakespeare or remembers enjoying Shakespeare? Shakespeare's really concerned about this. Especially Romeo and Juliet. If you remember your high school days, you probably read that. But the idea of feuding between individuals and then whole families and entire nations can feud with each other, eye for an eye, and nobody shows mercy. What horrible things are unleashed? Bodies on the floor by the end of the play. And Shakespeare lived not that far after a major civil war. People keep forgetting that about England. They had the War of the Roses. And Shakespeare, that formed his world, and he was very concerned about that because it's not just some political thing, it actually speaks deeply to the heart of man. Where man strives against his brother. And it bothered him. It should bother us. And it bothers Solomon. And one of Solomon's pieces of advice is to let the other guy have the last word. That doesn't mean you've lost. That doesn't mean you've lost. It means you've actually, you're the honorable man who's ceasing from the strife. Whereas the fool will keep on meddling and even try to stir up conflict. That's what fools do. They start fights. Wise men finish them. And the way they often do it, they can finish it through strength. That certainly occurs. And sometimes that needs to happen. But other times they finish it through what I'll call magnanimity. This kind of largeness of character where they let the other person have the last word and prove that person's the smaller person. That person who keeps obsessing over the last word is got the Napoleon complex. They're the smaller person. They're the one who's making the snipes. And they soon reveal themselves to be not worthy of the loyalty that others have been giving them. There'll be a few fools around him cheering him on, but most people will see who the smaller person is. And so what happens at that point, what's interestingly, you don't want to punch down. You know, trying to get the last word with somebody sometimes can be a matter of punching down. You want to be the big person. You want to have the gravity, the weight in the equation. And sometimes that manifests itself in not, keep taking an eye for an eye, but letting it go. Very interesting. I think it's very intelligent. It's wise, right? I mean, it's what wisdom is, and we don't appreciate it. So we always want the last word because of our pride. Thoughts? Next verse. Work hard early. Again, times of prosperity, you can sleep in. And in a way, you can't at times of difficulty. And there's also some metaphor going on here. Because Solomon's saying, don't just procrastinate and be unfruitful, day in, day out, in terms of your work day, but also your entire life. Think of a work day as a metaphor for your entire life. Be frugal and diligent in your youth. The harvest time of old age will hopefully be one of a harvest, of resources. It would be deeply ironic to go around begging at harvest when everyone's hauling in the plenty that they'd sown months before at the end of winter. So when do you start planting seeds? February and March. People don't know that sometimes, but your first crops, you start early. You kind of get up early. You tend to things early. And then you can reap a harvest throughout the whole time till the frost comes. Even after the frost, you can have things being brought in. You have to keep at it. Now, you think of that in terms of life. If you're an old person, people often attribute, the elderly often having more material resources, right? Your retirement, your funds that you've saved up and you've stewarded, you worked hard, you've got your acorn squirreled away. This is true. Somebody who's lived foolishly and profligate, who is not prepared, they come into those golden years impoverished. They haven't been saving up. They haven't been working hard and using the disciplines necessary to be able to provide for themselves. And so they go around their harvest time, their gray years, when winter is coming on, begging. Not a pretty picture. But I think it's actually much more about spiritual resources. If you get raised, if you're in a depression or whatever else, or whatever ups and downs have happened to you in life, and we know from the Bible, in terms of the material wealth can come and go. It's ephemeral. It's actually not the ultimate thing. And what Solomon's actually talking about, I think, are spiritual riches. People who have neglected their spiritual lives, and particularly the pursuit of wisdom, for all their decades and decades, when they reach old age, which is when they should have a lot of wealth to give in terms of spiritual wisdom, some of them will go around begging. And it breaks your heart. When I show up to a nursing home, I'm usually there to see, a parishioner who, we have a fruitful time of fellowship. They are grounded in God's Word. They're enduring what sufferings and trials of old age they face, grounded in God's Word and nourished by His Spirit, and it's taken them a lifetime. And then you meet people who are kind of on these existential crises, terrible state spiritually, and they're erratic, and they're filled with errors and foolishness. I hate to say it, right? Old foolish people, they exist. It's inappropriate, isn't it? Old foolish people, they exist. There's plenty of them, And they're like the guy who goes around harvest time when everybody's reaping in all their stuff, right? You're plenty. They are going around begging. Spiritually. They are spiritually impoverished because they've had a lifetime of foolishness. And I think that's really what Solomon's talking about here. Your bank account, sure, attend to it, be a good steward, but what's even more important is that your spiritual house be in order as you approach those years, and have something to bequeath to people. Right? You can be an asset even in your old age, because you can offer wisdom and prayer and guidance and counsel. We live in a culture that does not appreciate that. We worship youth, which deceives us to what we should want, which is wisdom. And that can be had from the elderly, or you could have been a sluggard all your life, and then, and then it's like a ninth inning sort of thing. And that's difficult. I mean, our guys, we have several guys that do nursing home ministries and missions, and that's what they'll find. You know, these people that have been neglected their own life, or been abandoned sometimes, or not just not raised in healthy churches, and then they're having to do a lot of catch-up in terms of things. What's going to be really scary, you know, assisted suicide is really going to be, it's going to prey on people like that. Because they have all these existential and spiritual problems, and they just want to escape the suffering, both physical and, I think, spiritual. And, you know, that's what they're going to do to escape. They're going to sin. Sin against themselves in a very existential way to escape. And it's self-destruction. It's literally self-destruction. You're murdering yourself. And you're going to bring people along with you to be assistants to the deed. And it's a horrible situation. And that's kind of one of the roots of what's going on here. We have a lot of people begging at harvest time. That's what I think. Am I wrong? Maybe. Think about it. Any other thoughts on this verse before we go on? All right. Moving forward. Verse 5 has to do with interactions with wise people. A man of understanding can draw out good counsel from someone else who is wise. I love this verse. I've seen it. I've seen it done. And, you know, you'll talk to somebody, he's like, let's go talk to such and such. Have you ever been in that situation of fly on the wall? Let's talk to such and such. You're like you're the gopher. You're just following them around their heels. And this person you already look to for authority and wisdom wants to find someone else's counsel, and they consult someone else. And then you see them draw from that person wisdom and counsel. Because oftentimes, what does the scripture say? They're like a well. They're like deep, still water in a well. You got to draw it out. And watching someone draw out wisdom from someone else, that's awesome. It does happen. It's hard to describe, except in the way that Solomon describes it, like getting water out of a well. Deep out of a well, you have to approach the question. You give all the facts in so that wise person can give you something of wisdom. It's really interesting. It's about asking the right questions, about bringing in all the factors. I guess the closest metaphor I have is someone who's really good at some sort of mechanical skill set, or is really good at a certain kind of plant, or really good at a certain kind of contraption, or I don't know, somebody who's really good at this, like really good with string instruments or some other sort of instrument, and they're a master at it, they know it inside and out, and you bring it to them saying, here's the problem, or a car, like a car engine, and they figure it through, and then, you know, the guy you looks up to someone else, is able to get something out from him. And that person who's able to get good counsel out of his advisors is kingly. It's kingly to know who your expert is and be able to get useful things, to do things, to live life, basically, with that. And the realm is blessed by that. You know, that's how you be a king. You know the sorts of people that have wisdom and then you know how to get wisdom from them. And it's not a predatory thing. It's a blessing all around thing. And, not everybody's a natural teacher. But they still have great wisdom and knowledge. How do you get it? You have to get good at getting wisdom from them. Have you ever been in that situation? It's really interesting. You meet people that, aren't immediately up front giving the lecture and lay it all out there. You have to know how to get it, how they communicate or whatever else. It's something to think about. It's something to think about because there's wisdom in being able to get wisdom from someone else. If you're dealing with wisdom, you're always going to be a borrower and a thief. And that's okay. You're a borrower, a beggar, and a thief because you are born foolish and ignorant, so you have to get it from someone else. It's a very conservative activity. Yes?
It kind of reminds me of the president and his cabinet.
Yes.
That's what the president should be doing.
President and his cabinet, right? You are good at state affairs, right? You're good at diplomacy, Secretary of State. What am I dealing with when I'm dealing with Ukraine? Tell me about this. Well, here's what you need to know, Mr. President. And when we're doing that, the executive branch has the element of monarchy within it. Because we're a mixed government, where's the monarchy come in? The executive branch. And what's interesting to me, a king would often have his cabinet, basically, of advisors. It's that image. But every man can, in a sense, be kingly in that he has his posse. And they're his advisors. He's the one who talks with them. He's the one, and your friends really matter. Your acquaintances and who you associate with really matters because they can make you wiser. Friends matter. Verse 6. Verse 6 presents a warning about others and an exhortation to be faithful. Right? Most men will proclaim everyone his own goodness. Right? Everybody brags about themselves. But a faithful man, who can find? An actual faithful man, somebody's actually worth all the praise, that's actually hard to find. And faithfulness is probably the most important characteristic. You think about loyalty. If you don't have loyalty, all the other gifts really don't matter. If they're not for you, if you can't depend on him, all the other, I don't care how good he is at XYZ, he's not going to be for you. And so that's thinking in terms of who you want to be your friend, but also what kind of person you need to be. Right? I'm not the best batter or shortstop or whatever, but I'm not going to be bribed by the other team and give away the playbook. Right? I mean, it's all over at that point. You need faithfulness, and you need that. That's the thing, that integrity, and that's what you need to be. That's what's valuable. And wise people know that faithfulness is valuable, and you need to be faithful. And you will be valuable.
And humble.
And humble. Right? You can beat your chest about how great you are all you want. It's when you show up in the clutch that matters. And that's scary, isn't it? I think it is. I think it's a good challenge to keep in mind. Verse 7. Integrity is a blessing to a whole household. Speaking of integrity, speaking of faithfulness, integrity, verse 7, is a blessing to a whole household. I have made my heart clean, and I am pure from my sin. And it's also, it shows how rare integrity is. And it also talks about our sinfulness. Right? The reality of our sinfulness. That's wisdom. To know thyself, to know you are sinful. And the need for that to be dealt with is, you start going down that path, you're on the path to wisdom. Verse 7, the just man walks in integrity, his children are blessed after him. Verse 8, a king that sitteth in the throne of judgment scattereth away all evil with his eyes. What does this mean? Kingship involves being a terror to evil. Few talk about this. It's been forgotten or neglected in our political imagination. Part of your job as a king is to fight evil. Next verse. 9 and 10. So we're back to integrity. Excuse me, I had skipped ahead when I was reading. Corruption is hated by God, especially when talking about matters where universal standards or law are at play. Favoritism of various sorts destabilizes one's realm and brings it under divine condemnation. It's interesting, we're talking about diverse weights and measurements, right? You have one scale for one person, and then you change up the setting of it, and it favors someone else, or it hurts someone else. That's what it's talking about, right? Uneven scale. You're taking advantage of one person, or a set of people, or everybody. And it's interesting, they're diverse. Your scales and measures are diverse, but do you know how they're alike? Scales versus measures, like rulers, right? You have diverse yardsticks and diverse scales. But guess what? They're not just diverse, they're also alike. They're alike in that they are an abomination to God. Do you get that? It's kind of funny, right? It's very memorable. These things are different, these different yardsticks and different scales. They're a different instrument. But what they're all alike, and what you need to know, and what unites them all, is God hates them. You can be an expert in manipulating things to hurt other people, right? That's what's amazing, right? You meet somebody who's good at crime or defrauding others. It's like a lot of thought can go into it, and there's an expertise and all little things that can cheat someone. And then it's like, well, you know what? They're all in line. What they're all the same is God hates it. You should have nothing to do with it. Thoughts on that? All right, let's do the verse 11 through 20.
Even a child is known by his deeds, whether what he does is pure and right. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Do not love sleep, lest you come to poverty. Open your eyes, and you will be satisfied with bread. It is good for nothing, cries the buyer, but when he has gone his way, then he boasts. There is gold and a multitude of rubies, but the lips of knowledge are a precious jewel. Take the garment of one who is surety for a stranger, and hold it as a pledge when it is for a seductress. Bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth will be filled with gravel. Plans are established by counsel, but wise counsel wage war. He who goes about his talebearer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with one who flatters with his lips. Whoever curses his father or his mother, his lamp will be put out in deep darkness.
All right, let's go through these. First of all, words are cheap. Deeds will tell the truth of the matter. Pretty straightforward. Talk's cheap. What's verse 12 about? Notice these are organs of learning and witness.
There's a difference between hearing and listening.
Yes.
And seeing and observing.
Right. And yet also, and so seeing, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord's made even both of them. Couple thoughts. First of all, kind of reminds me of God gave you 2 ears and one mouth. That old saying. He's given you these things so you can learn something. So watch and learn. The other is people are listening to you and watching you. You are being watched. Things are witnessed. You are being observed. I don't know about you, I always just find that unsettling. I hate it. I hate the feeling of other people are watching. It's not fair, right? It's kind of, you just want to curl up in a ball. You want some privacy. But what we do in privacy, of course, is we can misbehave when we think no one else is watching. And Solomon's warning his son, you're being watched, you're being heard. What you say, what you do, it's being witnessed. God's made it that way. God, that's what's in there. That's what creation's like. So it's a both and. It's a both Use your organs of learning to learn, but also know that there are witnesses. Verse 13, again, is about not being lazy. Verse 14, did I have this? Yes, okay. Verse 14. Learn how haggling and borrowing works. People aren't always honest when they want something. People are not always honest when they want something. What does Solomon say? Verse 14. He uses the, it's almost like buying a car, right? What happens? What goes on in the haggling? Oh, this isn't that great. You like say how much you basically don't want the car and how it's not that great, and then that makes the seller want to drive down the price, you think, and then they drive it down, and then when you leave, like, I got exactly the car I want, and I got it for a song. All right, well, that's just the way of the world, unfortunately. People are, it's somewhat dishonest, wasn't it? Solomon's not just talking about buying a car or a camel or whatever. He's talking about the fact that people behave differently and say things deceptively and misleadingly when they want something. And son, you need to know that. When someone approaches you, they will use the words and the gestures and they will try to play you like a fiddle, son. And it's not even for buying or selling. It's just they want a favor. They want you to make a decision as ruler if you have authority. They want a favor from you that only you can grant, or you among many could grant. And you can be naive. We can be very naive and think everybody's functioning out of good, desires and so forth and a goodwill, but Solomon says you can't. You can't be that way. That's not how people behave. Does that make sense? It's, again, one of those sad things you kind of wish isn't true, but it is true. Wisdom is better than material riches. We've seen that refrain before in verse 15. Verse 16 is about a healthy exertion of oneself. Hold people responsible for their obligations that they've made to you. Depends on your translation. You might use the word seductress. It can also be translated as foreigner. And the KJV probably renders it best as strange woman. And what's the picture here? I think the picture is shifty folks can be good at getting out of things they agreed to. Make sure you keep the receipt, keep the contract on file, or in this case, in ancient Israel, the garment that they left for surety. That's how they kind of cut a contract back then. Instead of saying, look, you signed on this dotted line, they say, you gave me your sandal. You gave me your coat, surety. It's like, well, people will try to get out of it. It's like, you hold on to that shoe, and you don't let them, wiggle out. You need to healthily exert yourself and stand up for yourself and for your household. There's a kind of real strength when it's not just you, but it's like your whole family's going to get hurt if somebody doesn't follow through on obligations made, and you got to grab a root and growl a little bit. And that's part of life. Hard lesson. We don't always want that. But that's how life is. Verse 17, deceit isn't worth it, although it'll seem like it at the time. This is a great insight with regard to temptation. Right? The devil always says it's not going to be a big deal until you do it, and then it's a big deal. Next, if you want to win, you need good counsel. Game plans really do help. Right? What's your plan here? Now, we also know from other proverbs that everything's in the hand of the Lord. Your plan can totally be thrown out the window, but that doesn't mean you are freed from the obligation to make some sort of plan. Right? Use some foresight, use some wisdom, and get something going. Have a strategy for this. Because so often, again, we're in the immediate moment, we're caught up in ourselves, and we don't plan. Next, you have a proverb against hanging around with gossips and flatterers. Because they'll talk about you and make you vulnerable. They'll hurt you. Right? Solomon's like, don't hang out with the gossip. Because if you're around them and in their earshot all the time, guess who they're going to gossip about? And then finally, you have a verse about honoring your father and your mother. Do we want to save this for another week, the rest of this? We're at 5 minutes till. Okay, let's do that. And then this will bring us to the end of this section. Maybe we'll do something next week. I know it's Memorial Day. It's already on paper. If not, we'll just take it up next year. Next summer. End of summer. Yes. Any thoughts or questions? All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Our Father, we thank you for your holy word. We thank you for your wisdom. We ask that you would lead us and guide us and help us apply what is in these scriptures, in these pages of your holy writ. We ask this in Christ's name.